It's a Matt world really was the perfect title for this week's episode. Most obviously it referenced the 1963 film It's a Mad World, in which we watched a group of competing individuals caught up in this rat race to find a large sum of money. Humorously and also tragically, as it highlighted some of the more broken parts of humanity, that goal is being chased both selfishly and blindly. For nearly every one of the characters in that film, nothing mattered more than that prize. Not safety, not charity, not love of strangers, nor even love for family and friends. And right there we can already see parallels to Matt's pursuits in this episode, and I would argue his pursuits over the entire series of The Leftovers. Though, to be fair, I would also say that there's ever been a conflict within those pursuits, a genuine pull towards sincere charity and selfless love. But while his actions, especially those in Season 1's 2 boats and a helicopter and Season 2's No Room in the Inn, were at the time more difficult to label as primarily selfish or chiefly enacted to earn favor and attention, this week's episode was a rather clear display of that man's heart and the fear and selfishness within it. Fear and selfishness that have driven so many of his actions. Which for me wasn't a huge surprise to finally have more fully revealed. After all, in the past we have seen brutal flashes of Matt's deepest driving emotions. Outbursts that have ranged from grabbing his comatose wife's face and shouting, "Look at me!" to quite literally smashing a would-be thief's into the pavement. In a way, that part of Matt really has been that submarine that we saw in the opening sequence of this episode. Hidden, contained, beneath the surface, but ready to go nuclear at any time. Additionally, that opening sequence was also representative of this show's often presented solution to stagnation, instability, illness, and brokenness, that being community and family. Looking back at the first 2 seasons, for example, we can see that message playing into their final, conclusive moments. At the end of Season 1, Nora found that solution waiting for her on the Garveys' front porch, and at the end of Season 2, Kevin found it waiting for him in his living room. And now, in the opening of Episode 5 of Season 3, we really see that sailor fleeing that solution, choosing instead to go it alone, relying solely on his own strength, judgment, and sanity, and consequently going off the rails quite quickly. And in this case, in one of the most extreme fashions possible. And we see Matt follow that same kind of trajectory this entire episode as well. The more that he distanced himself from his family and from his friends, the more dangerous and extreme his actions became. And if Matt and the way that he lived could be equated to that submarine, beneath the surface, contained, stealthy, then those that he found himself surrounded by and the way that they lived could certainly have been equated to that boat that they traveled on. On the surface, out there for everyone to see, and completely unashamed. And even as we've seen the Reverend in every single one of his episodes willfully choosing to enter these places of rather open debauchery, the casino, the migrant camp, and now the orgy ferry, it wasn't until this episode that we got a clear picture of how separate he still desired to be from the people in those places. He wasn't going there for them. And there were a number of moments this episode that really did that recoloring. So in Season 1, he passionately declared that he wanted to save those in the guilty remnant. But this week, hearing the sarcasm and the bite in his voice when he referenced Laurie's whistleblowing certainly robbed much of his Season 1 endeavors of their seeming grace and selflessness. In the same way, his encouraging of his pilot friend to leave his mother for some greater calling certainly tarnished my view of the care that he'd given to his own comatose wife for all of those years. Hearing him to declare to the captain, "I'm not one of those lunatics," also changed how I viewed his quote-unquote sacrificial return to the migrant camp to take the place of the man in the stocks. That action no longer felt like a desire to connect with and minister to humans, but rather stand above and apart from another group of lunatics, proving and justifying himself before God. And we cannot overlook Matt's response to someone else claiming to be God. How instantly offended he was just declared to me that that character was so thoroughly afraid that the deity that he placed on Kevin was fake. After all, if in fact someone else had died and come back to life, maybe Kevin really wasn't that special after all. And even worse, maybe God in heaven wasn't looking more favorably upon Matt for sacrificing everything for him. And really for a man who so desperately wanted to be different and set apart from those around him, especially those around him in this episode, the introduction of the David Burton God actually showed him and his beliefs to be, in a lot of ways, not all that different. After all, those on board, after seeing a 91-year-old lion named Fraser successfully impregnate a pride of stubborn lionesses, decided to use that random, inexplicable occurrence as their bannerhead, and that animal as their mascot, and indeed their justification in a way for how they now lived. So again, for Matt, the recognition that Kevin, his bannerhead, his mascot, and indeed his justification for so many of his actions may in fact actually be just as random and inexplicable was terrifying, and really was why an encounter with David Burton's God was the perfect way to conclude his trilogy of episodes. And for those of you looking for Easter eggs, the character has been seen and referenced a couple of times previously. In Season 2, seen twice in Purgatory, and shown to be the recipient of letters from the Pillar Man, as well as mentioned by Laurie's potential publisher. But really what made this such an outstanding conclusion to the Matt-centric episodes was also something that connected it to It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. In that film, the characters really were forced to pursue their goal blindly. They only received some very cryptic instructions from this dying man that the treasure would be buried beneath some W. And from that information and that information alone, they had to rush out, staking their all on nothing more than his word. And so it has been with Matt, and there were a couple of key visuals that really illustrated that journey well this episode, both his perception of it as well as the reality of it. The Christmas lights that hung in he, Laurie, John, and Michael's corner of the ship were visually reminiscent of stars, which were the heavenly bodies that the three wise men used to find their way to baby Jesus. And in that way, they represented what Matt fought to perceive about his own journey, that it was being divinely guided. But outside on the top deck, where there were no stars, only darkness all around, we got a glimpse at Matt's reality. He didn't know where he was going, or why. Which again was why getting to face the quote-unquote giver of those instructions, to ask him, to scream at him, where, when, why, how, was just so important for this character. But equally valuable was that giver's accurate judgment of Matt that he'd never really done any of it for him at all, but rather for himself. Just like he had when he was first diagnosed with leukemia as a child, all he wanted was for God to look upon him, to give him his attention. Another visual that just made for one of the most heartbreaking moments this episode, really illustrating Matt's reliance on his own strength, wisdom, and works, was him, after telling Michael, John, and Laurie that he would go to the infirmary to lie down, literally walking up to the cross. But instead of going in, resting in that place, trusting in its grace, and leaning on its finished saving work, choosing instead to work out his own salvation. With all that said, as hard as I've come down on Matt, and as clear as I thought his fear and selfishness were this episode, he remains a fantastically compelling and relatable character. At the episode's end, watching how David Burton was unable to, like Daniel was in the lion's den, close the mouth of that feline and keep it from devouring him, I couldn't help but understand, even just a little bit, that man's faith, and why he would read into such happenings miraculous and prophetic significance. The question does remain, though, will he continue to try and do so alone, keeping the focus of his world on Matt, or will he open up his world, allowing in community and family? Those are my thoughts, anyways, on this week's episode of The Leftovers. Definitely comment below and let me know what you guys thought of this absolutely insane episode of The Leftovers. Good gracious. But then again, this is The Leftovers, and this is the final season, and they're going to leave it all in the court, and apparently, and then some. So what do we expect? Also, I do apologize. This episode is at just a little bit late. I'm constantly juggling anywhere between 3 and 5 different jobs, and this is just kind of how it had to work out this week. Nonetheless, please do subscribe. I'm going to continue to review films and television on this channel, and I would love if you stay up to date on all of those things. But for now, I'm Chris Hartwell. This is The Heartbeat. Thank you for joining me.